Welcome to the France 24 debate. I'm Mark Owen. Israel's ground invasion is underway in Gaza. It's a move that flies very much in the face of a UN resolution calling for a ceasefire. The death toll among Palestinian civilians has risen steeply since the conflict began on October the 7th. Medical officials in Gaza say there are over 8,000 Palestinians who've lost their lives, the majority being women and children. The war began with the Hamas cross-border incursion that brought terror and slaughter to towns, kibbutz and a music festival. 1,400 innocent Israeli civilians were killed in that incident. 229 are still in captivity, kidnapped by Hamas. That figure has gone down by one this Monday as a female soldier who had been hostage has been freed by Hamas. This has been confirmed by the Israeli army. But on the ground, with the ground invasion going in and the images you've just seen very much showing part of the story, it's now set to become more harrowing and more horrific. We'll meet our panel to discuss the issues after this report from Charlie James.
Now striking via air and land, Israeli ground forces advance further into Gaza Monday. Israel confirming operations have been expanded and will escalate.
We're constantly evaluating the situation and advancing in stages according to our operational plans. The attacks will continue and intensify according to the stages of the war and its goals.
All signs point to Gaza City being the focus of what Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu called a second stage of the war. It's the biggest city in the enclave and Hamas's stronghold. Already being pounded from the air, tanks are now reportedly on the outskirts of the city. Urban ground warfare likely to dramatically raise casualties on both sides. Witnesses have also reported tanks along the main highway running from north to south. Israel had told Palestinians to use this route to escape the ground offensive. Now it is unclear if there is any way out. As ground battles rage, Netanyahu met with Israel's elite police unit.
We are fighting for our home, and we will win, with the help of these people and others who are viewed with the fighting spirit, the spirit of sacrifice, the spirit of victory.
Israel's ground assault has been shrouded in secrecy, likely to avoid tipping off Hamas, and some say to also avoid international criticism. Hundreds of thousands of civilians remain trapped in northern Gaza. The UN and humanitarian groups are pleading with Israel to take steps to protect civilians.
Let's show you the image live of the skyline on the Gaza Strip. The situation there, of course, extremely volatile. More strikes are happening. We'll bring you that image as soon as we possibly can. Let's meet our guests for the debate. Joining us by Skype from London is Dr. H.A. Hellier, Senior Associate Fellow in International Security Studies at the Royal United Services Institute in London and the Carnegie Endowment for Peace, International Peace rather, over in the States. Thank you, sir, for joining us. Joining us by Skype from Tel Aviv is Alon Pinkas, former ambassador, former chief of staff to 4 foreign ministers, political advisor to Shimon Peres and Ehud Barak. Thank you, sir, for being with us. Joining us by Skype from Washington, D.C., Michael Pregent, senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, former intelligence advisor with a real eye on terror activities and terror organizations. Michael, thanks as ever for being with us. Let's listen to Benjamin Netanyahu, who was speaking a little earlier. After that, we'll join our correspondent in Tel Aviv, Catherine Norris-Trent. First then, Netanyahu speaking just a while ago.
Just as the United States would not agree to a ceasefire after the bombing of Pearl Harbor or after the terrorist attack of 9/11, Israel will not agree to a cessation of hostilities with Hamas after the horrific attacks of October 7th. Calls for a ceasefire are calls for Israel to surrender to Hamas, to surrender to terrorism, to surrender to barbarism. That will not happen.
Benjamin Netanyahu speaking earlier. Let's go to Tel Aviv, where Catherine Norris-Trent is leading our team there, following every development for us. Catherine, good evening to you. Benjamin Netanyahu speaking there very clearly about no aspect of ceasefire to be considered. He says that kind of move would be effectively surrendering to Hamas. What is the mood where you are? Give us a sense of what's happening.
Well, there are a range of opinions here in Israel, and that's increasingly so as time comes on. I mean, pretty much everyone I've spoken to, not just here in Tel Aviv, but in other parts of Israel, have been down in the south, near the Gaza Strip, in Sderot. People there saying, look, there's no choice now for them. Hamas has to be eradicated, that they cannot live alongside them being in the Gaza Strip. So that clearly, we've seen a mobilization. We've seen people who in the past were out on the streets protesting against Benjamin Netanyahu, Now they're delivering supplies to the troops at the front line. So there's been people really rallying around that. There is concern, of course, for the hostages still inside the Gaza Strip, a great deal of pressure on the Israeli government to try and bring them home. And there is concern, I have seen it here on the streets of Tel Aviv, for civilians in Gaza who, of course, are also dying in large numbers as this military campaign continues. There was a small demonstration this weekend, a few hundred people calling for an immediate ceasefire as well outside IDF headquarters. So, this is a really traumatic time. It's difficult to understate just how big the sense of grief and shock is here in Israel following those deaths, those horrific scenes on the 7th of October. And that is still sending shockwaves through this country.
Catherine Norris-Trent in Tel Aviv, thank you, as always, very much indeed for giving us that sense of the mood there. Let's bring in our guests to talk more about the situation. A ground offensive at what cost is where we're kicking off this debate. First up, Dr. H.A. Hellier from the Royal United Service Institute and from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. H.A., thank you very much for joining us here on France 24 on the debate. We really appreciate it. In the sense of what's happening now with the ground offensive accelerating and being stepped up, where do you, from your perspective, see this moving? Where do you see it going?
So I want to just frame my remarks by saying we don't really have much in the way of correspondence or people on the ground in Gaza that are able to put forward color and information about what's happening on the ground, the incredible civilian and humanitarian catastrophe that is unfolding. So I think that's important for your viewers. We were able to hear from your correspondent in Jerusalem testify about, the great trauma that's ongoing in Israeli society. We don't really have that when it comes to Palestinian society. And Gaza isn't Hamas. Gaza is a Palestinian population in a strip of territory that has been under siege for almost 2 decades. And we're seeing an incredible cost being taken out of Gaza, out of the Palestinian population as a result of this offensive. When it comes to this offensive, to get to your question, there are a number of different aspects here that remain, how should we say, debatable or unclear. On the one hand, there's been discussions now about, okay, are we after eliminating and eradicating everything to do with Hamas? That sort of language seems to have shifted somewhat over the past week, because I think people realize that's not really possible. You can't simply eradicate an organization that's been allowed to grow over 2 decades, including, by the way, by Netanyahu's own government, which allowed money to go to that organization regularly over the past few years for a particular agenda. So it's not possible just to eradicate it. What can be done is to tremendously diminish the military capacity of it, but then what, and at what cost? Because if you have a society that has lost in the space of a couple of weeks 3,000 children as a result of Israeli strikes, what organization is going to come out of that kind of rubble? The second point that I think is very important is that there are increasing conversations, discussions, documents being leaked about the idea of quote unquote a solution for Gaza, but it's a solution that involves widespread displacement of the Palestinian population outside of the country. And we got to the point where Mr. Joe Biden, the United States president, had to actually come out and say that he spoke to the Egyptian president Abdel Fattah Sisi and say that they would do everything to ensure that there would be no displacement to Egypt. But we have already seen documents that were proposals from the Ministry of Intelligence in Israel talking about such a scenario. It hasn't been confirmed as the preferred choice of the Israeli government, but it is confirmed that there are these discussions that are happening at the highest of levels. And we've seen that even within the strip already, that civilian residential houses are being demolished by the IDF. And there are very disturbing videos that came out today about civilian cars just being blown out and blown into smithereens by the IDF. So we have very serious concerns here, I think, being expressed in DC, even among allies of Israel, allies that are very clear that they believe in Israel's right to defend itself. No questions about that, that have no moral misclarity when it comes to Hamas or anything like that, but being very concerned that what is currently underway is revenge, is a vendetta, is what, you know, Netanyahu's own spokesperson said a few days ago, the beginning of payback. That's not a strategic objective. It's not one that thinks about the medium to long term, and it's not the one that thinks about the day after.
Chehelia, thank you very much indeed. We'll get back to you very shortly. Let's bring in now from Tel Aviv, Alon Pinkas, former ambassador, former chief of staff to 4 foreign ministers, political advisor to Shimon Peres and Ehud Barak. Alon, thanks for being with us here on France 24. We appreciate your time, sir. You heard what Dr. Hello was saying there from London. My question to you will be, where does this ground offensive take Israel? Is this something Israel has to do? Benjamin Netanyahu was just speaking a few moments ago saying that any kind of ceasefire with Hamas would essentially be a surrender. That isn't going to happen. So is this ground invasion the essential move for Israel? And can the cost be one that can actually be carried? For instance, there have been 8,000 Palestinian civilians killed already. We've got a number of Israelis, 1,400 killed during the Hamas raids of October the 7th. This death toll is going to get higher and higher. Is that too high a price to pay, sir?
The question mark is the scale, the scope, and the duration of the ground operation. You know, we all use that term, ground operation, and we don't necessarily mean the same thing. There are various types, various magnitudes of ground operations. Storming Gaza with armored divisions is one ground operation. Search and destroy missions in closed quadrants or closed secluded sections, going in, getting out, that's another form of a ground operation, which would exact a smaller toll in human life, certainly of the innocent. So I really don't know at this point what the scale of the operation is. Now, per your question, was this necessary? Yes, it was. You cannot bombard Gaza from the air incessantly and hope to eliminate Hamas, which then raises the question, what does eliminating Hamas means? And the doctor from London was absolutely on the mark by saying, and then what? Now, here's the equation. If Israel wants to obliterate and eliminate Hamas altogether, both militarily and politically, which is a legitimate goal that hasn't been defined and set yet, but let's assume it's a legitimate goal, then that would necessitate almost inevitably to reoccupy the entire Gaza Strip for 2 weeks, for 2 months, for 2 years, for 22 years. I don't know. The question now is, and here's the equation, Israel doesn't want to occupy, Hamas certainly cannot govern. So what does the day after entail, the day after this ground operation? There are a lot of ideas, many are half-baked, as they say, which involve a lot of international actors, but all this will become somewhat, not entirely, somewhat clearer and more coherent once we know the extent and depth of this ground operation. And I'm sorry to repeat myself, I just don't know the size, the scope, the expanse of this operation at this point. I hope it's quick, as the Americans in Vietnam somewhat successfully and somewhat unsuccessfully tried to do search and destroy, S&D they call it. Getting into Gaza en masse with a huge military and then setting up camps and headquarters and immobility, by definition, that's not going to help anyone. One last remark per your question, Mark. A ground operation, as opposed to an aerial bombardment, would probably entail less rather than more casualties, certainly amongst the innocent. And so that's a, you know, in the midst of all this tragedy, that's somewhat of a silver lining.
Fewer casualties is your opinion, Alan. I'm hearing people saying differently, but obviously I respect what you're saying, sir. Thank you very much indeed. Stay with us, please. Michael Pridgen's up next, joining us from Washington, D.C., Senior Fellow at the Hudson Institute, former intelligence advisor. Michael, I know you've got great intel on Iran, Iran's possible influence. I know there's so many aspects of this that you could really illuminate for us. But can I start by putting the same question to you about whether this is necessary, this whole movement? We heard that from Alan Pincus, the word Vietnam being brought forward. The possibility of this being, is it possibly Israel's Vietnam situation? That could be a sort of a starting point for you. So what do you think?
I think it's more related to the American 9/11 situation. The October 7th attack was so brutal by design to get Israel to do what it's doing now, to get Israel to go into Gaza, to get Israel to target Hamas, and for there to be civilian casualties. That was the strategy for Hamas. And as we talk about this, I notice we're limited to Israel going into Gaza to degrade, diminish Hamas, but we're not talking about Tehran's red lines. What are Lebanese Hezbollah's red lines? When do the Iraqi militias go? We've already seen them starting to hit U.S. positions in Iraq and Syria, and the Israelis have actually hit Iraqi militias in Syria that were launching rockets and missiles towards Israel. So this isn't limited to Gaza. This isn't limited to the day after Israel completes its ground operation. This is the initial phases of a ground operation where Tehran has red lines, the United States has red lines, Hezbollah has red lines, and this could expand. And the key actor here is Tehran. Hamas, Iran did direct this attack. It did approve it. It will not allow one of its proxies to drag it into a war. Hezbollah is poised. Iran has its land bridge across Iraq to move in personnel, missiles, and rockets, and we've seen that since the fall of ISIS. So this is a situation where if the United States is going to put a deterrence policy in place, it needs to be a deterrence policy that specifically affects Tehran and the IRGC. Shooting down rockets and missiles is not a deterrence strategy. Killing the militiamen launching those rockets and missiles from Iraq and Syria and Yemen, that's a deterrence strategy. So I just look at it as a strategic, operational, and tactical intelligence picture right now. We're looking at the tactical in Gaza with the Israelis moving in, and then the operational phases, what everybody else is doing, and then the strategic implications. Can this draw us into a broader war?
And that is possibly the scary thing on most people's minds here. The UN, Michael, calling for that ceasefire. Of course, the US and Israel opposing that resolution. Michael, just back in what you were saying, a missile, according to the Israeli news channel I-24, a missile launched from Yemen, shot down over Eilat in Israel today. So clearly backing up there, Michael Pridgen, what you were saying. Let's get back to London to Dr. H.A. Helia, joining us from the Royal United Services Institute. There's a sense here that this is happening, H.A., that this is obviously going to go forward, and a sense clearly from Israel that this is the fate that needs to be followed and it has to happen. On the ground in Gaza, and I don't know whether you agree with what Alan was saying about the fact that this ground offensive could mean fewer innocent civilians being killed. Certainly, it is going to cause an enormous amount of damage. And of course, in the middle of all of that, people's lives will be shattered. That leaves a legacy, surely, of more hatred, more sense of having things taken away, and creates, perhaps some might say, even more problems going forward. What do you think?
So when we consider the history of radicalization and terrorist groups and extremism, I think there's always this factor of grievance, okay? It's not the only factor, but it is definitely a very important one. And I think that what we're seeing right now in Gaza by the Israeli forces, but also support for Israel's actions in other capitals around the world, a very limited number of capitals in the world, I might add. We're seeing, I think, the laying down of a lot of those grievances. And I think that we have to be very clear here. When it comes to Hamas in Gaza, the clashes that have taken place, the bombardments that have taken place of Gaza by Israel over the past sort of 10, 15 years at different intervals, what came out of that was a hardening of people in Hamas. It wasn't teaching them, quote unquote, a lesson or something. You know, this whole expression of mowing the lawn, this horrible expression that seems to be common in the Israeli security establishment, it has a repercussion. And I don't think that that repercussion is something that develops any process for finding a peaceful solution to the issue of the occupied territories in Gaza, in East Jerusalem, and the West Bank. I think, on the contrary, it simply means that the conflict becomes wider and deeper. And as a point of disagreement with your previous guest, I would say that when it comes to Iran's role, it has not been established that Iran directed this attack. In fact, that's incredibly debatable in terms of the intelligence that, at least that I've seen. And I think that the White House actually came out quite clearly and said that they hadn't made that assessment.
Michael Pregent, you go ahead, please. Michael Pregent, you reply to that one.
Yeah. The Biden administration said that they did not get a signals intercept from Khomeini directing this attack. You're never going to find that.
Khomeini.
These directives, Khomeini. These directives are not made that way. These are rolling meetings. We have Hamas officials meeting with Lebanese Hezbollah. We have IRGC Quds Force members meeting with Lebanese Hezbollah and Hamas. We have Hamas operatives trained in Iran before this attack. And we have the training going back 18 months. The Biden administration has done everything it can to defend Iran by saying we can't find the smoking gun, because you're not going to find it. It's not going to be a signals intercept. It's not going to be a human report. So
I'm not in the position of defending the Biden administration very much, particularly these days, but I don't think it's done everything that it can do to defend Iran, with all due respect. I think it's simply being very careful and cautious about how it stipulates these assessments are certain or not certain. I appreciate you have a different viewpoint on that. I don't have any skin in that particular game.
Gentlemen, thank you. Let's bring in Alon Pinkas, joining us live from Tel Aviv. Former ambassador, former chief of staff to 4 foreign ministers, and of course, former political advisor to Shimon Peres and Ehud Barak. You've walked with the giants of Israeli politics. You're looking at what happens now, Alon, in terms of what happens next. We heard from Benjamin Netanyahu earlier saying there's a time for peace and a time for war, quoting biblical language to justify what is going on. Nonetheless, innocent people are going to be killed in this. He said that Israel is doing all that it can to make sure that innocent civilians, all civilians are innocent, I suppose, do not get killed. We've had incidents where people have been told to move to certain places for safety. Those places have been, let's say by accident, shelled, and people have lost their lives. We can talk about the case of the Al Jazeera journalist whose family was wiped out, having moved to a safe place. Israel can't guarantee the safety of civilians going forward, can they? That's the fact in this matter, isn't it? They can't guarantee civilians will not be killed.
Absolutely right. I mean, no guarantees of such kind can be made. With the best of intentions, with the strictest moral codes, with the harshest rules of engagement and opening fire, in an enclave as dense and small territorially as Gaza is, with 2.25 million people inside, the idea that you can avoid civilian or non-combatant casualties is obviously ridiculous. That Mr. Netanyahu used biblical language, he's always governed through speeches rather than through actions, through cliches rather than through policies. So what can I say? We like to think that we're doing everything possible to prevent innocent human lives from being sacrificed. But you have to understand the public mood in Israel, which is not dictating policy, but nonetheless should be understood. It's not just about the revenge. It's about the agony, the devastation, a sense of humiliation that Israel needs to strike back. Now, striking back is in terms of international relations or deterrence theory or lofty expressions like massive retaliations and strategic proportionality. Okay, that's all beautiful. If there is no political objective to which the military means, the military means are aligned, then we're wasting lives, time, and money, and there's more misery on both sides to be expected. There needs to be a political objective. Now, that political objective could be bringing down Hamas. And as we spoke in the last segment, then what? Israel doesn't want to occupy. The Palestinian Authority will not walk in on Israeli bayonets or tanks. Egypt sure as hell doesn't want anything to do with 2.2 million impoverished Palestinians. The UN can't do it alone. And so there needs to be some innovative, creative thinking if this is going to be somehow politically negotiated. Until then, all we can hope for is to minimize, as per your question, Mark, is to minimize civilian casualties. To tell you that there, by the way, I need to make a correction. I didn't make a determination that there's going to be less casualties as a result of a ground operation. I said that compared to an ongoing aerial operation, a ground operation is likely to result in less casualties. I'm not saying there won't be casualties.
Here we are saying completely. That was my misinterpretation. I apologize. Go ahead.
That's okay. Now, as for Iran, I mean, I don't want to turn this into an Iran debate, certainly after the two gentlemen spoke. Look, this is not about Iran's direct involvement in planning October 7th. This is about Iran's inspiration, encouragement, endorsement, and funding of a web of proxies, terror proxies, meaning with the intention and deliberate goal of undermining regimes in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Yemen, in Gaza, and if I were the Saudis, I'd be careful too in the near future. So this is absolutely about Iran. Now one more point out, and then I'll leave it to the other gentleman. We've been talking about escalation for the entire first or second week because escalation is a real possibility, and because the U.S. warned of escalation, and the U.S.'s military naval presence in the Eastern Mediterranean is unprecedented, and it's all about deterring Iran from expanding or escalating, or so-called horizontal escalation, rather than vertical escalation, which is the firepower we're going to use in Gaza. Horizontal is about an expansion or spread, as President Biden called it, into Lebanon. Lebanon is directly, Hezbollah, the Shiite militia in Lebanon, is directly controlled, funded, and politically supported by Iran. So Iran is very much in this game.
Alan Pincus, thank you very much indeed. Michael Pridgen, can I come back to you in Washington, D.C. at the Hudson Institute? From your intelligence background, do you get a sense that Benjamin Netanyahu now talking, as Alan says, in a grandiose, sometimes cliched way, but nonetheless being very clear and trying to be a strong leader, in some way, did he drop the ball coming into this? Should there have been more awareness among, say, Israeli intelligence about what was happening? And if that's the case, how did they get sidetracked or sidelined in this way?
Absolutely. There are intelligence failures on the Israeli side, on the American side. I mean, no one saw this coming. Apparently, there was some chatter, but again, we put such a high emphasis on a signals intercept or a human intelligence report, and then we ignore the chatter going on in Telegram, the chatter going on the streets. You have to pay attention to that. Not every attack is going to come from that, but an attack like this, there aren't going to be indicators in a signals intercept or a human walk-in source telling you that this is about to happen. There were intelligence failures here, and that's why Iran's hand is all over this. These operatives trained in Iran. Where did the paraglide assault force? Where did they train? Did Israel reconnaissance see them practicing in Gaza? No, they did it in Lebanon, or they did it in Iran. They did it in other places, and there are what we call intelligence requirements now that will look at training camps across Iran's sphere of influence to see where this type of training is occurring. But this was a complex attack designed to be so brutal as to get Israel to do exactly what it's doing now. That doesn't mean Israel fell into a trap. It just means Israel has no choice but to respond. And with every terrorist organization, anytime a leader is killed, there's degradation. Anytime charismatic leaders are killed, there's degradation. There was degradation in Al-Qaeda when Osama bin Laden was killed. There was degradation with ISIS when Baghdadi was killed. And there's definitely been degradation with the Quds Force after Soleimani was targeted by a U.S. Drone strike. So you get the argument like what comes next. And it's almost an argument not to do anything about the current situation. You have to go in and you have to degrade Hamas leadership, and you have to expose the fact. I mean, one of the things that your reporter said was the majority of the casualties are women and children. Well, where are the men? I mean, where's the talk about Hamas conscripting the men to fight, to set up mortar plates, to set up rocket positions in civilian areas? Where's the reporting about Hamas telling the civilians to stay in place and that their job is to become a martyr? That's why the Palestinians in northern Gaza haven't moved south, because Hamas has not allowed them to do so. And why is it that Hamas will conduct an attack and then cowardly go into the tunnel system, but not allow civilians to go into those tunnels? Where's that talk?
Okay.
Michael, thank you. I'd sense it's H. Elliott wants to get in. Go ahead, sir.
I figured you might disagree with that.
Yeah,
but talk. Where are the civilians in the tunnel complexes? They're not there. It's only Hamas operatives. They have the fuel, the electricity, and the food.
Let Dr. Elliott reply, please, Michael.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so I think quite a lot here. So first of all, we don't have reporters on the ground in Gaza that are able to talk about all of these things, precisely because Israel will not allow for international journalists to get into Gaza and have not allowed for several weeks. So, you know, there's a lot of speculation here about what is or what is not going on the ground. But, you know, we've certainly heard from the limited number of Palestinian journalists that are on the ground that scores of people did flee from northern Gaza. They were not stopped by Hamas. There's been a massive displacement of people, and that many decided they didn't want to leave because they thought that actually there's no place that is safe in the whole of Gaza, so they'd rather be in their homes in quote-unquote dignity and die there with their families rather than flee into some sort of squalor in the south. So, you know, I think that's important. On the Iran point, I never thought that I would be on a program where I had to give some sort of balance talk about Iran, because I'm on the record as being pretty harsh on Iran, but really clear here about how certain we are about our assessments. The links between Iran and Hamas are extremely well known, far better, of course, in terms of Hezbollah. They're much more ingrained there. But especially when we talk about Hamas, we're talking about a group that exists and was sort of grown up through the context of an occupation in Gaza. It's not simply a puppet of Iran. I think that overstates the issue, and it makes it very difficult for us to then understand precisely the problem that we are facing here. Again, I want to reemphasize this point the third time over. We don't have international journalists on the ground in Gaza because it's not allowed for them to be there. Otherwise, we'd be able to put a lot more color to what's being discussed here. And we're not doing that. We're speculating. 27
journalists so far killed in this war, which adds to what you're saying there, H.A., about the situation, about informing. And it's the choice that I suppose we as journalists take to go to these zones to unearth the truth as best that we can. It's part of our job, and it's something that we take on. And I salute my colleagues who've been there and tried, and obviously thoughts with the families of those who've lost their loved ones in the process, as indeed thoughts with everybody who's been affected by this whole conflict, whichever side of it you may be on. Because fundamentally, I think what all four of us would agree on, I'm sure, is that peace is what we want. And how do we get there? That's the question. Do either of you three have a great idea about how we get to peace? Because once upon a time with this story, we were talking about a two-state solution. We were talking about maybe even sort of moving refugees back to places that once was actually their family home, those kind of things. all this seems a long way away now, doesn't it, completely? The whole equation has changed. Alan Pincus, can I bring you in on that one? I mean, the idea of two-state solution, it just seems like something that will never happen now, doesn't it?
Well, yeah, okay, there's an optical illusion here, Mark. Until the 7th of October, talk of the two-state model, the two-state solution, was conventionally and comprehensively derided as something that is not feasible, not viable, cannot work, will not work. The Palestinians, are split between the West Bank and Gaza. There's a messianic, lunatic, extreme right-wing government in Israel. Forget it. It's not going to happen. Then the 7th of October, this harrowing, terrible, murderous and bloody day occurs. And everyone immediately says, well, you're never going to have a two-state solution now, are you? So here's where it may prove to be an optical illusion. Because of the magnitude and the fundamental horror that occurred on the 7th of October and since, there could be a reckoning. I can see the idea of a two-state solution in a different context with different modalities, not more of the same, not going back to 2014 when then Secretary of State John Kerry was negotiating, or going back to George W. Bush, or indeed going back to the Clinton parameters of December 2000, January 2001 when he published them. I can see, however, a situation in which both sides are going to realize and become more aware of the unsustainability of the so-called status quo. And I can see a scenario, not immediately, not tomorrow. I don't want to sound untethered or completely detached from what's happening. But I can see a situation where 6 months or 12 months down the road, there's a different government in Israel. Hamas is weakened beyond recognition. The Palestinian Authority is somewhat strengthened. And the U.S. and the Saudis get involved in ways in which they haven't been in the last decade. So I'm not here to sound optimistic, and I'm not selling you cotton candy in a fair. But what I am saying is that what happened on the 7th of October may turn out to be an optical illusion in terms of, the peace process is dead, buried, and will never be resurrected. It could actually happen the exact other way around.
So there could be an opposite reaction to it. That's what I'm hearing from you, and that's something that I think is something that I think I'd find. I might find it difficult to buy, others who would buy into that, but your experience, I bow to and respect, sir. Thank you very much indeed. Michael Pruitt, do you have a thought?
Yeah, Hezbollah has a vote, Hamas has a vote, Palestinian Islamic Jihad has a vote, and so does Iran. I mean, we keep looking at this as a Palestinian decision with Israel. It's not. But these terrorist groups exist to wipe Israel off the map, not for a two-state solution. That's my point.
That was, of course, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad who coined that phrase, wasn't it? Wants to wipe Israel off the map. Dr. Helia, over to you.
So just to shift gears slightly for a second, because we've been focusing quite rightly on Gaza. We forget that there's a lot going on right now in the other part of the Palestinian occupied territories. That's the West Bank. Since this crisis began, since the offensive began on Gaza, we've seen a great uptick of violence in the West Bank.
122 dead there.
Yeah, by the way, there is no Hamas, okay? These deaths are the result of extremist settlers moving in, being responsible now for ethnic cleansing. And I use that expression very deliberately and very carefully, but ethnic cleansing of Palestinian villages in the occupied West Bank. And when we talk about a two-state solution, we miss this completely. It's extremely difficult to imagine anything remotely resembling a contiguous state in the West Bank when it's completely dotted all over the place by illegal Israeli settlers, and removing the ability for there to be some sort of unified territory there, which is why you have progressively over the past few years, Israeli rights groups, Palestinian rights groups, European rights groups, American rights groups, international almost consensus on the fact that at least within the occupied territories, there is apartheid. Again, a word I do not use lightly, but especially when you look at how it exists in the occupied territories in the West Bank, I don't know how you can get to a two-state solution without recognizing this immense barrier to trying to have some sort of contiguous territory.
Go ahead, Alan.
Can I make one remark here?
We're getting towards the final remarks, so please go ahead, Alan. Go ahead.
This is a remark to both AH and to Michael. Gentlemen, I'm an expert on why not. I'm a veteran of it won't work. I've been through, it'll never happen. I'm here to indulge Mark. When I provided that silver lining, it wasn't a result of a sound geopolitical analysis the way you guys presented it, and I cannot agree enough with with the things both of you had said. All I am saying is, do not necessarily think in the same patterns of thoughts that you had before October 7th. There is a possibility that post October 7th, there will be a clear division of two axes. And Saudi Arabia and Israel and the Palestinian Authority and the U.S. will be on one side, Iran, Hezbollah, Hamas, and the others will be on the other side. Once there is that clarity, I think that people may change how they look at the two-state solution. I'm not saying it's viable. I'm not saying it's contiguous. You're absolutely right, AH. But hey, if I listen to what both of you are saying, there are going to be several more October 7th, and that's not something I'm looking forward to.
Gentlemen, final question, final answers coming up. How can we get this to stop, this ground offensive? Clearly, there will be more civilians who die. Alon, you corrected my misinterpretation of what you said. That is a situation. There seems to be this sense that it has to happen. That's what Benjamin Netanyahu is saying. But is there any way it can be stopped? Any realistic way it can be stopped? Michael, can I get you to start?
Yeah, I would just say that if we really want to get, make some headway here, we have to deal with Tehran. Have Hamas leaders leave Gaza, go to Qatar, go to Tehran, go somewhere where they think they have safe haven, get all the hostages out, and tell Iran to stop. But Iran's not going to stop unless you threaten it. You have to talk to Tehran. Tehran has to believe you're serious. And right now, Tehran doesn't believe the United States is serious at all. Deterrence has to mean something. And, Iran plays a key role in this. Qatar plays a key role in this. But both are supporting the Hamas side of this. And that's a problem.
Michael, thank you. Dr. Helia, Ece Helia.
So there was a United Nations General Assembly resolution a few days ago. Almost the entirety of the world's population voted in favor of a ceasefire. If we want to have any movement whatsoever that leads to a de-escalation where the hostages are freed, where there is a lessening, not even an ending, but a lessening of the humanitarian crisis that is unfolding in Gaza, then I think we need to be very clear that a ceasefire is a prerequisite to any progress whatsoever. Qatar was brought up. Qatar has been involved and thanked by both Mossad and the National Security Advisor of Benjamin Netanyahu for its role in trying to intervene and mediate in the release of the hostages. And Qatar said itself, when escalation happens, it makes our job a lot more difficult. So ceasefire is in the oeuvre of those who are engaged in the hostilities, and that, by and large, is the Israeli military. So I would start there.
Dr. Hellier, thank you very much indeed. Alan Pincus, thank you too. I'm sorry there's no time for a final statement from you, but I think we heard exactly where you're coming from, sir. Thank you very much indeed. And thank you to Michael Pruitt joining us from Washington as well. Thanks to you all for watching, wherever you are in the world. Do stay with us. More coverage, of course, of the situation in the Middle East to come and all the world news here on France 24.